Imagine being buried alive beneath the streets of ancient Rome, sealed in absolute darkness with nothing but a flickering lamp and the sound of earth being piled over your tomb. This wasn't a nightmare. This was the law. And if you were one of Rome's sacred temple virgins, it was the price you paid for a single forbidden touch. In the year 337 BC, a young woman named Minutia stood trembling in the temple of Vesta, knowing that within hours she would be sealed beneath the earth to die slowly in the darkness. She was 23 years old. She had served Rome faithfully for 15 years, chosen at age 8 from one of the city's most distinguished families to become one of the 6 Vestal virgins who kept the sacred flame burning. She had memorized every prayer, mastered every ritual, lived in luxury and reverence as one of Rome's most honored women. But 3 months earlier, she had fallen in love. There had been stolen conversations in temple gardens, whispered words that became embraces, a kiss that became what Romans called the unforgivable violation of her sacred vow. She had convinced herself the gods would understand, that her years of faithful service would count for something, that perhaps she could keep her secret until her 30 years of service ended and she was finally free to marry. She was wrong about everything. The investigation started with whispers, with one of the other Vestals noticing how Minutia smiled during prayers, how she seemed distracted during ceremonies. Then came the formal accusation, the interrogation that lasted hours, the arrest of the man she loved. Under pressure, he confessed everything, hoping to save himself. He did not succeed. Now Minutia stood in the temple as the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, entered with a college of priests following behind. She knew from their faces what the verdict would be. Her legs weakened, bile rose in her throat, her vision narrowed. The Pontifex Maximus spoke the ritual words, declaring her guilty of incestum, the crime of defiling her sacred body. He pronounced the sentence that Roman law required, his voice emotionless, reciting words that had been spoken many times before and would be spoken many times again. She would be dressed in funeral garments, placed on a covered litter so no one could see her face or hear her voice. A Vestal being taken to execution remained invisible and silent, already dead in the eyes of Rome. She would be carried through the streets to a place called the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness, where an underground chamber had been constructed specifically for this purpose. There, she would be given a lamp, bread, water, and a small bed. Then she would be sealed inside with stone and earth piled over the entrance. Her screams would go unheard beneath tons of earth. Her prayers to Vesta would remain unanswered. Her body would be left to rot in darkness, because a Vestal who broke her vows could not be executed directly, as that would shed sacred blood. But she could be buried alive and left to die slowly, technically by her own body's failure rather than by Rome's hand. It was a legal fiction that allowed Rome to destroy its sacred virgins without technically violating their sacred status. Minutia opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to explain, but the Pontifex Maximus raised his hand and guards stepped forward. Within an hour, she would be underground. Within days, she would be dead, and Rome would replace her with a new 8-year-old girl who would be told Minutia's story, a warning about what happened to Vestals who forgot their duty. If this story has gripped you, if you want to understand how one of history's greatest civilizations could normalize something so unspeakable, then subscribe to this channel right now. Because what happened to Minutia wasn't unusual or extreme. It was simply how the system worked, and her case was only one among dozens of recorded executions and hundreds more whose names were lost to history. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what you're about to learn reveals something profound and terrible about how societies can justify the unjustifiable when it serves religious and political purposes. But Minutia's case, as horrifying as it was, happened when there was at least some evidence of an actual relationship. What happened in 16 BC shows how this system could destroy women who were almost certainly innocent, how accusations could become weapons, and how no defense mattered once charges were filed. That year, a Vestal named Urbina would die underground not because she had violated her vows, but because Rome needed someone to blame for its greatest military disaster. Let me tell you what really happened to her, because understanding her story reveals the true darkness at the heart of this thousand-year practice. Urbina had become a Vestal virgin in 230 BC, chosen at age 10 from a senatorial family that considered her selection a great honor. For 14 years she served faithfully, known among the other Vestals as particularly devout, spending extra hours in prayer, volunteering for the least desirable duties, showing none of the interest in the outside world that sometimes tempted younger Vestals who had been cloistered since childhood. But in August of 16 BC, everything changed. The Carthaginian general Hannibal crushed a Roman army at the Battle of Cannae, slaughtering between 50 and 70,000 soldiers in a single day. It was the worst military defeat Rome would ever suffer. The city went into shock as survivors streamed back with stories of complete destruction. Families waited for news of dead sons and husbands. The Senate struggled to understand how Rome's supposedly invincible legions had been so thoroughly destroyed. In the collective trauma and fear that followed, Romans looked for religious explanations. The gods must be angry. Someone must have offended them. Some ritual must have been performed incorrectly, some vow violated. The trauma needed a target, and the Vestal virgins, as keepers of Rome's sacred flame and the embodiment of the city's purity, became obvious suspects. Urbina was accused of violating her vows, though the accusation was vague and the evidence minimal. Someone claimed to have seen her in conversation with a man near the temple. Someone else said she seemed less attentive during recent ceremonies. A third accuser suggested her appearance had changed in ways that implied she was no longer pure. None of these accusations would have been taken seriously in normal times, but these were not normal times. Rome needed to demonstrate to the gods that it took violation seriously, that it would punish any potential offenders, that it would restore its sacred purity through blood and suffering. The trial was quick. Urbina was permitted to speak in her own defense, but the evidence didn't matter. The quality of her defense didn't matter. Rome needed a sacrifice to appease angry gods, and Urbina would serve that purpose whether she was actually guilty or not. The day they took her to the Campus Celeratus, another Vestal named Floronia was executed alongside her, also accused in the post-Cannae panic. Urbina was 24 years old. She had spent more than half her life in service to Vesta, had done everything Rome asked of her, had maintained her vows with absolute dedication. None of it saved her. The guards placed her in the underground chamber, a space approximately 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, just large enough to stand or lie down but not to move around. They gave her the ritual lamp and bread and water, then sealed the entrance with stone and earth. Historical records suggest she survived for several days underground before dying, though how anyone knew this remains unclear. What we know for certain is that her execution, along with Floronia's, did not appease the gods or restore Rome's military fortunes. Hannibal continued devastating Italy for years. The execution served only to demonstrate Rome's willingness to destroy its own sacred virgins when political and religious pressure demanded victims. But even before Urbina and Minutia, there was Appia, in 483 BC. When Rome was still a young republic, Appia had been a Vestal for approximately 15 years when she was accused of violating her vows. The historical record is fragmentary about the specific accusation, with sources disagreeing about whether she was accused of actual relations with a man or simply of not maintaining the sacred flame with sufficient diligence. What makes Appia's case significant is the brutality of the punishment and the way it established the precedent that would be followed for centuries. Unlike later Vestals, who went relatively quietly to their deaths, Appia fought. She screamed as they carried her through the streets. She begged the crowds to intervene, to save her, to show mercy. She called on the gods to witness her innocence. She struggled against the guards who held her arms. The Roman historian Livy, writing centuries later, recorded that Appia's cries disturbed many Romans who witnessed her execution. But he also recorded that no one intervened, that the execution proceeded exactly as prescribed by law, that even those who felt sympathy understood that Roman religious law could not be questioned based on individual cases. The principle was more important than the person. When they lowered Appia into the underground chamber, she was still screaming, still calling for help that would never come. The guards sealed the entrance while they could still hear her voice, muffled now by earth and stone. And then there was silence, and Rome went on with its business. And Appia died alone in the darkness, and a new young girl was chosen to replace her. These three women, Minutia, Urbinia, and Appia, represent different eras and different circumstances, but they all ended the same way. Sealed underground in out darkness, left to die slowly while Rome watched and approved and maintained that this was necessary, that this was pious, that this was what the gods demanded and what Rome's survival required. And there were so many more like them across Rome's 1,000-year history. Women whose names were recorded and hundreds more whose names were lost. What happened to them wasn't an aberration or a mistake. It was the law, carried out with precision and ritual, accepted as normal and necessary by one of history's greatest civilizations. The lamp would burn out after a few hours, the air would gradually become stale, and in that final darkness each woman would understand with absolute clarity that no one was coming to save her, that Rome had decided her life was worth less than the appearance of religious purity, and that her death would change nothing except to add another name to the long list of women sacrificed to appease gods who never answered. Leave a comment below and tell me, how do you think history remembers these women today? Were they martyrs, victims, or something else entirely? Because understanding how we talk about their deaths might reveal as much about us as it does about ancient Rome.